Chapter 15. After a short rest, Allan forced himself to his feet. Although he was very tired, he was anxious not to miss the hunting party. He called to Nancy and picked up the tracks again. He noted that the hunters did not go inland but seemed to be following the edge of the shore. Some hours later he ran across a wide circle of trampled down snow where the hunters had obviously rested for a while. He sank to the ground, thoroughly discouraged. He had counted on the fact that a man traveling alone would surely overtake a loaded sled and dog team. But somehow he had missed them. Now well rested, the party had gone on, and Allan was at the end of his strength. His body refused to take another step without some needed rest. He was even too tired to eat, though he did melt a few mouthfuls of snow to ease his thirst. Sunk down in the snow, Allan felt himself dropping off to sleep. He knew he should try and find a better shelter, but it was still below freezing, and the cliff edge where he now rested was open to the wind. His head dropped to his knees as he crouched in a snow pocket. In a minute, he told himself, just a minute's rest, and then he would go on again. Some time later he was awakened by whimpers from Nancy. He struggled to his feet, swayed upright for a minute, then crashed to the ground. There was no feeling of any kind in his feet, and they were obviously frostbitten. Once more forcing himself erect, he used his fowling piece as a staff and stamped his feet up and down until, slowly, some feeling returned to his toes. After a while, both feet began to throb with pain. He welcomed the pain, knowing it was a sign that the blood was once more freely circulating in his feet. Meanwhile, Nancy had been digging furiously at the ground. Allan went over to where the animal was pawing at a low mound of snow. The snow had been all trampled and packed down. Together he and Nancy dug down until they came to a layer of rocks. Allan managed to lift aside one of the heavy slabs, and underneath it he found the frozen body of a seal. Taking out his carving knife, he hacked and chopped out a piece of seal meat for Nancy and threw it to her. He would have fed her more, but the meat did not belong to him. Allan covered up the seal carcass and packed the snow tight around the rocks. Then he went to the edge of the low cliff and looked out over the frozen sea ice. He could not see very far in the poor light, but there did not seem to be anything moving out there. He retreated to the food mound and sat down for a moment to think. He had to catch some rest before he went on. Sleep, perhaps, he could do without. With the freezing temperatures, he probably would not drop off for more than 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch before the cold got through his clothes and woke him up. But his body, especially the muscles in his legs and thighs, cried out for rest. Allan began to puzzle over the food cache. Whoever the hunters were, they had been careless in covering up the seal. Polar bears or wolves would make short work of the mound if they happened to run across it. Even the small but clever Arctic fox would eventually find a way to get at the meat. Unless, of course, the hunters meant to leave the meat there for only a short time, while they went back to their village to tell others of their kill. But why not bring the seal with them? Or perhaps they had left the meat there to go out hunting again. But if it were seal they were after, wouldn't they head right out onto the sea ice? Instead, they seemed to be following the shore. Of course, they might be following the shore because the land was a good 50 feet higher than the frozen sea and would offer them better visibility. Allan was faced with a difficult choice. He could stay where he was, hoping the hunters would soon return for that seal. Or he could once more follow their tracks and hope to overtake them. Either way, there were dangers. If he stayed, the weather might change and the hunters' tracks be buried under new snow. Nor could he be sure that someone would soon return for the seal. Suppose something happened to the hunters. Suppose while crossing a thin patch of ice, the sled and men went through and were drowned. He could wait forever before anyone showed up. On the other hand, if he decided to follow the tracks, He might not be strong enough or fresh enough to overtake the men before his own strength gave out. He might die of starvation on the trail. Or he might lose the tracks entirely. Or the trail might stop at open water, where the hunters had arranged to meet other men with boats and continue their journey by sea. But whatever he decided to do, he simply had to take a few hours' rest. He called Nancy and commanded her to lie down. He then took the leash out of his pack, tied one end to Nancy's collar and the other end around his wrist. If the hunters returned, he did not want Nancy getting into a fight with her dogs. When that was done, Allan lay down on the ground, using Nancy's body as a shelter from the wind. In a few minutes he dropped off, his first true sleep in almost 48 hours. He was wakened several times in the next hour as Nancy tugged on the leash. The Arctic daylight came again, and the bear got curious about a large white bird that landed on the ground some 20 yards away. Allan woke up and looked over at the bird. Nancy kept tugging on the leash, wanting to go over and investigate the new arrival, but the bird fortunately took off and Nancy settled down again. Allan was able to go back to sleep. The next time Nancy woke him, she was whimpering. From the way her head was lifted and moving from side to side, Allan knew that she had scented something. "What is it?" Again, Nancy whimpered. "Somebody coming?" Then Allan heard the cries of someone far out on the ice. He got to his feet. Now he could hear the unmistakable barking of a dog. Quickly he fitted the homemade muzzle over Nancy's snout. She did not like the muzzle and tried to paw it off her nose and mouth. "Stop," Allan ordered. Nancy whimpered and sat down on the snow. Allan crept forward to the edge of the cliff and looked down. Now, at the last minute, he had doubts about his meeting with these strangers. Suppose they were savages who might decide to take no chances and kill him on sight. Allan knew little about Eskimos, but he had heard all the usual rumors about them from the superstitious sailors of whaling ships. Some Eskimos were supposed to have only one eye in the middle of their foreheads. Others were supposed to dig holes in the snow, crawl in, and go to sleep for the winter. Some sailors of that time even believed that the bodies of Eskimos were covered with scales, which was why the cold had no effect on them. The last rumor probably got started when some sailor saw an Eskimo roll completely over and over in his kayak without seeming to get wet or even cold from the freezing water. Down below, 3 men were easing a loaded sled through the jumbled shore ice. The dogs strained and 2 of the hunters lifted and wrestled the sled through a narrow opening between 2 blocks of ice. For a moment the hunters were lost to view. Then they reappeared with the sled and dogs at the foot of a low cliff. One of the men, seeking a way up the bluff, noticed Allan above. He called to the others, and the 3 hunters gathered in a knot to stare at Allan. Allan stood up and called down to them. In his excitement at talking to humans again for the first time in nearly 2 years, he forgot that they would not understand his language. "Hello down there! I am from the whaling ship Ann Forbes out of Aberdeen. I am shipwrecked, a castaway. My name is Allan Gordon." One of the hunters shouted something in reply, and Allan, still expecting to hear English, thought the man was telling him to wait. At this, Allan did a little dance of joy on top of the cliff, throwing his arms up in the air and hopping back and forth from one foot to another. His excitement caught Nancy, and she also stood up. Allan held her by the leash and called out, "Have no fear, the poor brute is tame." But the 3 Eskimos were thoroughly frightened now. One yanked a spear from the sled while the other 2 urged the dogs to turn around. Allan's dance of joy they took to be threatening gestures, and when the bear stood up, it only added to their terror. What kind of human traveled with a bear? Nor did they understand a word that Allan had said. They did not recognize his strange dark clothing, none of which was made from sealskin or caribou hide or polar bear fur. Nor did this dark stranger make the usual sign of greeting between Eskimos who did not know each other, hands up at the shoulder level, palms facing outward. It is little wonder that they decided to forget their meat cache and get as far away as possible from that devil up there on the cliff. The Eskimos were no less superstitious than the sailors, and wanted nothing to do with the sort of supernatural beings who traveled around with polar bears. Eskimos, too, had their evil spirits, their devils who dwelt in the belly of the earth or high up on glaciers. Hardly able to believe his eyes, Allan watched the hunters turn the sled around, and heard the cry of one of them urging the dogs back out on the ice. At that moment he fell to his knees and began to weep. To have come so far, to have suffered so much, only to be denied the chance of rescue at the last possible moment. "Come back!" he cried. "Please, come back!" But his cries were ignored.